Now that you've been introduced to migrant workers and the history of the times and John Steinbeck, I'd like to talk a little bit about the book of Mice and Men and just introduce the book and the two main characters and set the stage for you as we begin reading it. The book of Mice and Men was, again, written and published in 1937. The focus of the book are two friends. Their names are George and Lenny, and they are migrant workers. And they are not migrant workers because of the Depression. They are migrant workers who, like many men of from late 1800s through the early 1900s, did migrant farming as their career. And they traveled around from farm to farm, in some cases in a formal relationship, where they actually, had a relationship with those farms and would travel from season to season, and so they were expected. In other cases, as in the case of our two main characters, they receive a work card from one of the government agencies that was working to help match workers with need in California specifically, and so they had received a card and they were on their way to their next job. So that's sort of the setup of the story as we are introduced to it. So the setting of Mice and Men is actually takes place in Soledad, California, which is, located right here. So Salinas here is where John Steinbeck grew up, and so there is a farm area in California, in a valley, and it is called Soledad, and around there is very rich farmland, and so that is the setting that John Steinbeck creates in the Salinas Valley for this novel. It's southeast of Salinas. It is located on the Salinas River. And the countryside described at the very beginning of the novel, so the scene that we see at the beginning of the novel, as well as the ranch itself, is actually based on Steinbeck's childhood, his home and his experiences. And in fact, the ranch itself, as I mentioned earlier, is based on Spreckels' sugar farm where he worked several times throughout his childhood and his early adulthood. And then this area that we see at the very beginning of the play is part of the exploring that he did as a young person and some of the areas that he discovered. So very much based on his childhood experiences. In Of Mice and Men, as I mentioned, there are two main characters, George and Lenny. They are given work cards from Murray and Reddy's, which was one of the government farm work agencies actually established to help, again, coordinate resources, workers with need in the area. In this story, the characters of George and Lenny dream of having a, quote, a little house and a couple of acres. So their goal, their dream, is to have land of their own and to actually buy a farm. So they're traveling around to work in order to save up enough money to buy their own land and have their own farm. And so they don't have to keep traveling around for work. So that is their objective in doing this work that they have been doing for several years. In the introduction, or the first chapter, they are trying to save money. You get reference to this, to buy their own land, and they are in the process of walking to their next job, or they've been dropped off by a bus, and now they have to walk to their next job, and so they're taking a break from that. The themes, let's talk a little bit about the themes of Mice and Men. There are 5 main themes that we see throughout the story, and we will be talking about them. The first big theme is friendship, and we see this in the story between George and Lenny, as well as some of the maybe the early friendships that they start to develop, but primarily the focus is George and Lenny and their relationship. Another theme is dreams, and what happens to dreams, how they can be stopped by forces beyond our control. This literature is realism and naturalism, kind of bordering into modernism in this story, and realists and naturalist writers tended to be very pessimistic. They were writing during the Second World War, and World War I, and they lived through both of those, and it really changed the authors of the time. And a lot of them who started off very romantic and optimistic about possibilities, as they covered the wars and as they grew up in early 1900s, they really became much more pessimistic about people's circumstances and their abilities to overcome obstacles in their lives. And that really is a significant characteristic of realism and naturalism literature, which this can fall into. And so we definitely see those elements as we read the book, and that's an interesting introduction to how various American literature periods are identified. Another theme is loneliness and weakness, and we see characters in this story that are lonely. Just the migrant worker lifestyle tended to be very lonely. It was very unusual for men and friends to travel together. So George and Lenny are somewhat of an anomaly in the sense that they travel together and they're friends. Usually this is quite a solitude experience, and leads to a lot of solitude, and so therefore it's quite lonely. And then there's also this element of weakness. What happens as you age? What happens if you get hurt? And we see this addressed in the book as well. Another theme that comes out, and this is also part of the pessimism of realism and naturalism literature, is the unreality of the American dream and the inability of people to actually achieve it. How realistic is the American dream, and can people really achieve the American dream? And this issue is also addressed in the book, and we see lots of scenarios here, both chapter by chapter as well as the book as a whole, that really addresses this idea. And then lastly, kind of a smaller theme is the role of the elderly in this society, because as these migrant workers age, there's a lot of fear associated with what they're going to do, because once they cannot work, they're not landowners, what happens to them? And so there's an element of that helplessness that comes out in the book as well. So we'll definitely be hitting on each of these themes as we talk about the book, and one may stand out to you more than another, and you'll have an opportunity to share that as well. Just to introduce chapter 1, as a kind of a preface to our reading, because George and Lenny are the main characters, the book starts in chapter 1 with only those two characters in the scene. As I mentioned earlier, John Steinbeck wrote of Mice and Men, and while it is a novella or a short novel, it was written as well to be staged. And so in each chapter you see that there is a particular setting that is in that scene only. And so it doesn't move from setting to setting. Each chapter focuses in one location. And chapter 1 takes place by a river, a clearing, a few miles from the farm that they're in the process of walking to, and they stop for a break. By the way, this clearing is actually a symbol of the Garden of Eden. So for those of you who are familiar with kind of Bible history, the Christian Bible history, the Garden of Eden is the perfect place where Adam and Eve were created and where they lived until they sinned for the first time. And the Garden of Eden was really meant to represent a perfect, safe, and ideal location. And we see the characters start the book there. We also see the story end there. So you have this real sense of safety in this particular scene, or of just the ideal location. And again, just a reminder that these scenes set up like scenes from a play. So chapter 1 takes place only in this setting by the river, and that's where the entire scene takes place, or the entire chapter. Just as a heads up to you, there will be a CSC assignment from chapter 1 where you're really focusing on describing our two main characters, George and Lenny. I'm going to ask you to think about their motivations. What are they working for? What are their dreams? What's really driving them to do this work for now? What are the conflicts that get identified in chapter 1? There will be a couple of different conflicts that you have a chance to look at. And you'll be thinking about writing around 10 to 12 sentences. So that CSC will be assigned at the end of chapter 1. But as you're reading it, I want you to be thinking about these questions. So that concludes the introduction for Mice and Men. Please make sure that you've completed the notes section on that sheet that you've been working on. I think it's the last section on that page. And then you can go ahead and we'll get started with our discussion when you come to class.